Over the years, we've seen a lot of number 10 Downing Street from the outside and very little from within. Now on BBC Two, watch and learn as the truth comes out of the Cabinet.
Every Thursday, ministers go to 10 Downing Street for the weekly Cabinet meeting. The Cabinet Room is the government's chamber of secrets. And all those who've ever served in Cabinet remember exactly what the Prime Minister said when they were first asked to join.
He said to me, "You've got to put a cold towel around your head and work for 6 months and no gimmicks."
Mrs. Thatcher asked me if I'd like to be Energy Secretary, which I didn't want to be.
I had a strong feeling that he didn't particularly want to appoint me to anything, but I knew he needed a young woman, and I knew he needed to get me on somehow.
In theory, the Cabinet takes the vital decisions affecting the lives of the nation. But since Tony Blair came to power, there's been a dramatic change in the role of the Cabinet.
Tony's acting more like a president than a prime minister, and in that situation, the Cabinet itself is dead.
The Prime Minister listens to the views of his Cabinet, but he is the Prime Minister. He does make decisions.
This programme looks at how, in times of peace and war, Tony Blair and other Prime Ministers have run the Cabinet that has traditionally been the very heart of government.
Right, Jack, why don't you start us off with the current diplomatic situation? Right.
On Thursday, just after the fall of Kabul, Tony Blair's War Cabinet met. This is the first time a War Cabinet has ever been filmed.
The Security Council resolution went through yesterday and the terms are satisfactory.
That will then effectively mean that as the situation calms, we're able to get a force in under a UN hat.
Well, the hat is this, and this I gather in the Security Council speak is adequate. But it's not Chapter 7, it's not formal authority. No, it's not blue hats, no.
To run the war, the top military and intelligence people sit with Blair's senior ministers and advisers. The War Cabinet was meeting in the room where cabinets have met since the 19th century to declare wars and make peace. The mood in the War Cabinet contrasted sharply with the high spirits when the full Cabinet had gathered for its last meeting of the summer session in July. Tony Blair's Cabinet, where for the first time nearly a third are women, looks very different from the days when cabinets were all male and included many hereditary peers. The Cabinet meeting came on the day that it had been announced that the Chancellor, Gordon Brown, was going to become a father.
Before I ask you to come in, Robin, well, first of all, I think we should record our congratulations to Gordon. Life's about to change in a big way. The second thing is just
to join the Cabinet means that you've arrived politically. In theory, the Prime Minister is first among equals, and you are one of the equals. And all those who've ever had their own red box retain a vivid memory, even after nearly a quarter of a century, of the first time they ever went to number 10 for a Cabinet meeting.
Of course, it was a great buzz. I mean, here we were on the threshold of what then seemed like an enormously exciting journey. Well, it turned out to be an enormously exciting journey. But there was all the sort of excitement of a new opportunity, of having won, of knowing that, if power is available to you in government, you've got your hands on it.
And I can remember the excitement of walking through that number 10 door, and the excitement of my colleagues that we were now in the Cabinet in number 10. And we all sat down in our pre-arranged seats. I was next to David Blunkett, which was a great pleasure because Lucy used to sit under the table, so I used to take my shoes off and put my feet under Lucy.
When they go into Cabinet, all new ministers are told exactly which chair to sit in. The Prime Minister sits at the centre, in the only chair with arms. The most powerful ministers sit next to or facing the Prime Minister in strict order of precedence.
And what about the order of precedence in a cabinet? How much does that matter to individual cabinet ministers?
I don't think it matters very much. I've never thought that really mattered. It's not really first-class people who worry about where they're sitting.
Well, they would all show a certain distance and disdain for such trivial ratings, but they care passionately.
Why?
Well, because it sees where you are in the pecking order.
Out of a cabinet of 23, I think there are only 2 had been in government, none of them had been in cabinet. So to that extent, it was new to all of us.
Tony said, "Call me Tony." And we just automatically did what we'd done in opposition, called each other by our Christian names.
As well as the new informality, Blair planned a radical change in the traditional role of the cabinet. He felt that a cabinet of 23 was far too large to be an effective decision-making body. He wanted to work in much smaller groups, and the most potent cabinet subgrouping of all would be himself and his longtime friend and rival, the Chancellor Gordon Brown.
He's doing a bit. He's doing a bit.
The pattern was set before the cabinet had even met for the first time. Blair and Brown decided that the Bank of England should take over control of interest rates. When the head of the civil service suggested to Blair he should consult his cabinet, Blair replied, "They'll agree." At the Treasury, 4 days after Labour had come to power, with the cabinet still not having met, Gordon Brown summoned a press conference.
I will not shrink from the tough decisions needed to deliver stability for long-term growth. I have therefore decided to give the Bank of England operational responsibility for setting interest rates with immediate effect. The government will continue to set...
The journalists had been told about the groundbreaking decision before almost all the members of the cabinet.
I read it in the paper.
So, I mean, this big decision to privatise the Bank of England, the cabinet didn't know about it?
Well, it wasn't discussed beforehand, no.
I was privy to the decision, that they were good enough to tell me about it, and I knew it would be a controversial decision, and I think that's the kind of problem you might have had if you had a complete discussion about that, and there's all the matters of the markets and everything else. Interest rates is an area where it's always been that Prime Ministers and Chancellors have largely made decisions like that. There was certainly no disagreement with it.
Yeah, I suppose what people...
But we didn't have a sit down and put your hands up, are you for this or against it? No, we didn't.
All recent Prime Ministers have kept decisions over extremely sensitive matters, like the markets, security and running a war, to very small groups of senior ministers. But for other major matters, Blair's predecessors have made more use than him of the full cabinet. And all Prime Ministers have had their individual styles of running the cabinet. Labour's Harold Wilson, who won 4 general elections, liked to see himself as the player-manager of his cabinet team.
When I was Prime Minister in the 60s, hardly a single one of them been in the cabinet. I had to go and do everything. It was like, football, taking the set-piece occasions, goalkeeper, taking the penalties and the corners. Now, of course, I have a very talented and experienced cabinet. Even so, I like to know all that's going on.
Harold Wilson's style of running his cabinet was subtle and often tricky. He would sometimes deliberately set minister against minister to try and ensure he got his own way. This was no easy task in a cabinet of political big hitters from both the right and the left.
I tried to keep our party together for God knows how many years now, and I did it by having all the extremes in the cabinet.
There were very interesting people in the cabinet. When I look round and I think of Wilson and Roy Jenkins and Jim Callaghan and Tony Crossland and Barbara Castle and so on, they were really interesting people. And I found those discussions were the best I ever attended, in the sense that you were affected by the debate. You might go with one opinion and change your opinion in the light of the debate. And it was that reality, I think, that gave cohesion to the government.
What brings you here?
The boss.
The boss.
Coffee, and then they want us all out. Angus, hello, in you go. Any particular? I'll bring you all out in a moment.
From the start, Margaret Thatcher knew what she wanted and was determined to lead her cabinet from the front.
Coming out of the bloody zoo.
Mrs. Thatcher said she couldn't waste time with internal arguments in her cabinet, and she was impatient of ministers who sought to persuade colleagues in cabinet of views that differed from her own.
Now we go over to the centre.
it was your job to explain to colleagues what the issues were and what your recommendation was, you'd very rarely get through your explanation without Mrs. Thatcher coming in to try and steer the conversation the way she wanted it to go. And the only thing to do was to wait till she paused for breath and start again. And in the end, you had to steel yourself to do that. I found it very difficult because I'd been brought up in a sort of traditional British way, a sort of public school educated, where there was a sort of deference to women. You just didn't sort of, take them on in that sort of sense. But one soon learned that if you wanted to be trampled underfoot, that was the way to go.
She believed that every discussion should start with a statement of her own views, and that's what happened. And there were, of course, people who weren't used to arguing with a woman, and they resented this fact because they thought it meant there was to be no discussion. Actually, she saw this as a prelude to a discussion if discussion was needed.
If her ministers had been man enough to challenge her on policy issues, she was there to fight them over it. Trouble is, most of them ducked out. They didn't like argument. They were either too frightened for the implications for their future political careers, or just didn't relish the concept of argument.
Over the years, Margaret Thatcher became an increasingly dominant figure in her cabinet. Those who'd once been her closest supporters were to be alienated by her abrasive and intimidating style in the cabinet chair.
I think sometimes the Prime Minister should be intimidating. There's not much point in being a weak, floppy thing in the chair, is there? But I spent hours getting the facts. I spent hours deploying them. It was known, it was my whole approach. I was fascinated by statistics and having had the training in science, first find the facts and then deduce your conclusion.
John Major consciously reacted against the Thatcher style.
I've only got one thing to say. It's nice to be back.
His first cabinet was all male and known as the Cabinet of Chums.
You don't have to shout and stamp your foot to make decisions. It's not always the people who shout loudest who have the most to say. It is often someone who perhaps is a little reserved about putting forward an idea, who perhaps has something that's wholly original that ought to be properly examined. So I do encourage that. It does often mean longer cabinets, but I think that is worthwhile.
Now, John is an immensely consensual person. I mean, he, first of all, he'd have seen how not to do it and wanted to have a reaction to that. But he is, by nature, a guy who, whilst he has his own very clear views, he's very courteous and very patient and does listen and treat people with respect. And so the atmosphere changed overnight.
One of Major's ministers said that at first it was like the release of the prisoners in the opera Fidelio. They'd emerged blinking into the sunlight of real cabinet government. But it was not to last. Ambitious young Eurosceptic ministers like Michael Portillo and John Redwood joined the cabinet as the Major government ran into stormy waters.
I was over the moon to become a cabinet minister. It didn't quite work out as I was imagining when I first joined it. I soon got the impression that the Prime Minister didn't like extended or lengthy debates in Cabinet. He felt they would be divisive, whereas I felt that we had some disagreements that needed to be aired and that we needed to seriously ask ourselves where we were going.
Major grew to feel increasingly under siege as his divided cabinet began to fall apart under pressure. When Tony Blair took over, he decided to run cabinet in a very different way. Rather than taking contentious issues to the full cabinet, Blair preferred to try and reach agreements in cabinet subcommittees or on a one-to-one basis with ministers. Other prime ministers had also done this, but none had taken it as far as Blair.
He inherited a situation where the alleged benefits of decision-making at cabinet meetings had been exposed to be politically disastrous for the Conservative Party under John Major and disastrous for this country and the people who live in it and jobs here. It was terrible. So he set his face against that perfectly understandably and worked with individuals or small groups of ministers or through cabinet committees and seldom through the full machinery of the cabinet.
Look, I would be pretty shocked
if the first time I knew a cabinet minister felt strongly about something was if they raised it at the cabinet table. I would expect them to come and knock on my door and say, look, Tony, I've got a problem here. I disagree with this or disagree with that. And that happens from time to time. And people do that. And then you sit down and you work it out.
The Millennium Dome provided a rare example of a big issue going to Cabinet. The dome was just a computer graphic when Blair came to power, and the government had to decide whether to go ahead with the project. It was still just a vast building site in Greenwich. And 6 miles upriver, Blair held a cabinet meeting. He began by saying that he'd become convinced that the dome should be built, but he then handed the chair to his deputy, John Prescott.
He announced to me that he had to leave because he had to do the House of Commons church service, and I was a bit surprised and said, "You're going to the church service? Well, if you're leaving me, say a prayer for me, will you?" Because there were very strong views about the dome.
Quite a number of people were saying, well, if it doesn't succeed, it'll be a waste of money, and I have to confess I was rather more extreme than that. My view was that £750 million, even if it succeeded, it would be a waste of money compared with spending it on other things.
At the cabinet meeting, Dobson said the best thing to do with the dome would be to fire it into outer space. Most other ministers were also against the dome, although Gordon Brown suggested it might go ahead if some strict conditions were met.
I'm in the chair and I hear those views and I report properly back to a Prime Minister the general view of the Cabinet and how the debate went, and then for the Prime Minister to make a decision.
Within 2 hours of the cabinet ending, Blair himself arrived at the dome site in Greenwich for a major photo call, along with Prescott and the Arts Minister Chris Smith. Although a majority of the cabinet ministers in the discussion that morning had come out against the dome, Blair announced that the project would go ahead. You communicated the discussion that had taken place, but then the Prime Minister took the decision about to go ahead with the dome.
He did, yes.
Right.
And I think about an hour or two later we were at the dome actually announcing that and looking at it.
But the Cabinet itself hadn't taken that decision to go ahead with the dome.
Well, in the sense that when the Cabinet makes a decision, what we don't have is a vote on it. There's never been a vote. This is this mysterious areas of Cabinet. You take soundings and voices. And I gave him the voice, and I gave him what I thought the best possible position was, and which would accommodate most of those views of the Cabinet. And he made a decision based on that. I didn't hear of any resignations after, did you?
We're going to take a grip on this, we're going to drive it through, we're going to make sure there's a permanent legacy, we're going to make sure the costings are right, we're going to make sure that the management...
As jets passed over Greenwich, Blair was asked how much opposition there'd been in Cabinet to the decision to go ahead with the dome.
That's a Cabinet decision. Look, everyone is worried about making sure that the actual ideas are right.
Blair's way of running a Cabinet contrasted sharply with the last Labour Prime Minister before him. 25 years ago, with the economy in deep financial crisis, Jim Callaghan applied to the International Monetary Fund for a huge loan.
It's not bloody funny, Jim Callaghan. Yes, it's not funny. It's not.
The country was in turmoil and facing bankruptcy. Callaghan's cabinet was deeply divided. Left-wingers opposed the IMF loan and wanted a siege economy. But the right argued that the cabinet had to accept the terms the IMF was demanding.
It means sticking to the very painful cuts in public expenditure on which the government's already decided.
With his Chancellor, Dennis Healey, barracked at the Labour Party conference, Callaghan decided that his ministers from the left and the right and the centre should thrash out the whole matter of the IMF loan round the cabinet table.
I decided to have a series of cabinet meetings and allow every member to put in papers to the cabinet, which wasn't really heard of. Tony Benn and all the rest of them, those who wanted to, they put in their papers, to have them discussed by the cabinet, and to allow anybody who put in a paper to be cross-examined by his colleagues.
Callaghan handled it very skillfully. He allowed the whole argument to flow. And because I had put up the most radical alternative, he devoted a whole day of the cabinet to my proposal, and it was torn to pieces, and although there was some support, it was defeated.
Cabinet meetings on the IMF loan went on day and night over a period of 2 weeks.
For me, it was an absolutely fascinating microcosm of the way that a cabinet works, though probably much more rocky and uncertain in terms of the outcome than most modern cabinets, which are much more controlled.
Jim Callaghan's view was, let the argument all come out, and then in the end we'll win a majority for the view. And he was very successful in getting exactly what he wanted in the IMF, though even in those debates we won a few concessions. There weren't cuts in benefits that had been proposed.
I went through all that exercise, and at the end I had a united cabinet.
Callaghan had managed to secure the loan on the terms he wanted and not lose a single minister.
Callaghan was masterly. Even those who lost out on the argument couldn't fault him for being collegial. It did show in Technicolor that cabinet government as political insurance in difficult times is probably the only way to do it when you really are under duress. And that was duress with a capital D that autumn.
During Tony Blair's first term, he had the advantage over Callaghan of a booming economy and a huge majority. But Blair doesn't share the view that Callaghan's handling of the IMF crisis was the finest flowering of cabinet government in peacetime.
You know, the old days of Labour governments where I think the meetings occasionally went on for 2 days and you had a show of hands at the end of it. Well, I mean, I shudder to think what would be happening if we were running it like that.
Blair has brought the techniques that he used to create new Labour into the way he runs Number 10 and the cabinet system. He says a strong centre of power is essential if the government is to deliver. Many more people now work for him in Number 10, and his closest advisers have become very powerful figures with White House-style titles like Director of Communications, Head of Government Relations, and even Chief of Staff.
I think it's a lot to do with Tony's style. I always likened it in my head to being like a law firm for him. He was one of the partners. He had half a dozen or less partners that he worked with, and ideas filtered down through the business.
But are you saying that these sorts of people who were not elected actually had more power than the cabinet ministers themselves?
Not in terms of their own departments, but they had more power in relation to the Prime Minister in terms of the cabinet. But as the cabinet seemed to have no power, they seemed to be operating instead of the cabinet.
It's not that I want everything done via me, but I mean, we have a programme. It's my job as Prime Minister to deliver it. And so inevitably, if you don't have a strong centre and you're not keeping focused on what's happening in departments, then you're not running the government properly. But I don't know about this. I've got a feeling with this thing that if you have a strong idea of what you want to do and believe in pushing it through, then you're an inverted commas dictator, and if you're not, then you're weak. And he pays your money and he takes your choice on that one. But I don't feel myself. I mean, this idea that we don't, that I don't discuss things with ministers or any of the rest of it, it's just not true.
Blair and his team keep tight control over information coming from the cabinet. His press secretary attends cabinet so he can give the media the official line and try to prevent leaks. Many previous governments, like those of Harold Wilson, had been seriously undermined by leaks from the cabinet. And Wilson, like Blair, took a special interest in seeking to stop them.
Harold got really obsessed with leaks. There was tremendous secrecy around the place. And of course the Cold War meant that there was all that secrecy and all the rest of it. But it was mainly politically embarrassing leaks that Harold would get furious about.
I remember on one occasion we had the whole morning devoted to leaks. Wilson warned us. And then the discussion about leaks went on for so long we adjourned for lunch. When we went out, the Evening Standard said, Wilson warns the cabinet. So we all brought our Evening Standards in and said, Harold, how did that get out? Nobody left the room. Oh, I don't know, said Harold, but of course he told the press that he was warning us about leaks.
As the years went by, leaks from John Major's cabinet were to become a flood. He began to feel isolated in Number 10 as his authority was steadily eroded. He suspected members of his own cabinet of leaking against him, one in particular.
The suspicion was that it was John Redwood, but I couldn't be certain of that. Several of my senior colleagues had said to me that they were very concerned about the amount of leaking. They felt that John may be responsible simply because a number of the leaks came from meetings that he had attended, but they didn't know any more than I did.
Well, I didn't leak cabinet discussions, and I think it's wrong to do so. although a lot of cabinet discussions do get leaked or briefed by prime ministers and their advisers. That is a well-known phenomenon. I think it is much better if these things are conducted privately.
In fact, Redwood's own chief advisor has subsequently confessed to leaking, and many of John Major's other cabinet ministers and their advisers were also at it. Tony Blair applied the lesson to the way he ran his cabinet.
John Major's government had been brought down practically by the publicity given to Barneys at cabinet meetings, with all sorts of people leaking how so-and-so had had a go at so-and-so, and 6 people had lined up in favour of this and 5 people in favour of that. That was disastrous, and I think quite naturally Tony Blair doesn't want that to happen with his government, and so that's a sort of constraint on what happens at cabinet meetings.
Tony Blair's ministers arrived for the regular Thursday meeting of the cabinet. They're not expecting to stay for very long, for they know that Tony Blair doesn't see the cabinet as a suitable place for taking big decisions after lengthy debate. But Blair does feel it's useful to bring his ministers together once a week, both as a bonding exercise and to keep them up to speed on what's going on across the whole government.
I went in thinking the Cabinet would be a body for discussion and debate. It wasn't. It was a committee where it was a meeting where Tony outlined what he was doing, Gordon outlined what he was doing, other senior politicians said their bit, and that was it.
And she could have kicked off a discussion like I can. Anyone can. You just then, when it comes on the agenda, you raise it. That's what cabinet government's about, and I said this to you before. Cabinet government does depend, of course, having people who feel they're, members of the cabinet, where, this is the forum by which we make the decisions, where we translate a policy determined by a movement and put them into government policy. If you couldn't have discussion there, what's the point of having it? Now, if her analysis was right about what goes on in cabinet, it's just a different cabinet than the one I know.
Right. Okay. Let's start up.
Fixed items on the Blair cabinet agenda each week are reports from senior ministers.
Discussion about that, then I should give you a briefing about President Bush's visit and the things we're going to be discussing then. And then I think John should take us through the current situation in Northern Ireland as well, which is a very critical stage and where I think we'll see developments over the next few days that I hope are of a positive nature, but we can never be sure. So, Robin, over to you.
The only day we have confirmed is on Monday, 22nd October, when we'll do the remaining stages of the Homelessness Bill.
And to ensure that their publicity is coordinated, at each cabinet meeting, ministers are given the grid, a detailed list of coming events in the following week.
You'll remember that I set out that we'll be writing round with a rush of bills.
Although the cabinet sometimes holds political strategy meetings at Chequers, known as away days, at number 10, big policy decisions are not on the agenda.
Major bills in each of the big public service areas, and it's just essential that we get the basic work done on them as quickly as possible.
I don't think we took big decisions as cabinet, no.
Really?
We discussed them,
Yeah.
and then Tony made up his mind.
But you wouldn't, the cabinet wouldn't have a big discussion, and you'd then take a big decision in the cabinet.
I don't remember any, no.
I mean, has the cabinet made any really big decisions as a cabinet?
Well, it's always dealing with the strategic matters as a cabinet, whether it's the away day or the day itself. There have been some big issues that have been involved. I mean, Europe's one that's mentioned, of course. Day-to-day things about the steel industry, problems, the motor car industry. We discuss all those things, of course. But they're not as if it's black or white, yes or no. I mean, they're just general updating and discussing amongst ourselves how we will deal with them.
At 11 o'clock, just half an hour after the meeting had begun, cabinet was over. Very short meetings have become the norm. And Tony Blair's people say that because things have been going so well until recently, there'd been no need for longer cabinets. In 1975, the player-manager Harold Wilson was in deep trouble. There was to be a referendum on whether Britain should stay in Europe, and his cabinet was split down the middle. Roy Jenkins led the pro-Europe ministers, and Tony Benn the antis. Wilson's cunning plan was to allow ministers to campaign on opposing sides.
And then he made this completely unprecedented statement that for this purpose and this purpose alone, the cabinet would be free to breach the absolutely central principle of collective responsibility. And what was so striking was that we all then got onto different platforms, arguing with one another. We all kept to the one issue of Europe.
The cabinet ministers in favour of Britain staying in the common market campaigned across the country for a yes vote in the referendum.
I think if we come out, we will be a country which turns in on itself, which has no sense of responsibility beyond itself. And I think, if I may put it very, very directly, I think that would break our hearts as a country.
We've got a great future, but we'll exercise that future not by sulking on our own, but by working with others within a grouping in order to make the world a better place for us all to live in.
I believe the British people, when they vote no in this referendum, they will gain a new sense of liberation, a new sense of their own power and their own prospects.
The anti-market cabinet ministers, led by Michael Foot and Tony Benn, also crossed the country with a no campaign.
Throughout the campaign, it was a bit like being in limbo. I was still a cabinet minister, but your civil servants treated you as if you were, I don't know, suspended. So, I mean, in that sense, Harold very wisely allowed the freedom necessary for the government to survive. He saw it was a way round the difficulty when he had a divided cabinet and didn't want to sack half of them.
After weeks of campaigning across the country on separate platforms, Harold Wilson agreed that for the first time the two leading cabinet ministers could even confront each other on television. Wilson had calculated that by showing flexibility over the normal cabinet rules, Europe needn't break up his cabinet.
Roy said a moment ago, in a sense, that we must give up some of our political liberty in order to enjoy
some
this...
of our political sovereignty, which is a quite different matter.
Sovereignty
Pool our
is
sovereignty.
Well,
no question of giving up liberty at all. And
well,
please
give up the liberty...
Don't put words like that.
No, but give up the liberty to decide our policy through...
It was a civilised discussion, in the sense there was no hostility, putting quite contrary views, and then afterwards returning to the same cabinet. And I think that was a very good example of what I would call the maturity of politics.
After Thursday, we're assured by the Prime Minister that their freedom to argue, at any rate in public, comes to an end. Gentlemen, thank you both very much again, and good night.
John Major didn't have Harold Wilson's success in holding together a cabinet that was deeply divided over Europe. He came under bitter attack from the Eurosceptic Chancellor he had sacked. And when it was suggested that Major should fire a further 3 Eurosceptic ministers, he revealed his frustrations in remarks that he thought were off the record.
But where do you think most of this poison has come from? It's come from the dispossessed and the never-possessed. You and I can both think of ex-ministers who are going around causing all sorts of trouble. We want 3 more of the bastards out there.
John Major was treated extremely badly by the Eurosceptics in the party. Europe became the obsessive issue of that one element of the Conservative Party. And they behaved disgracefully. There's no question about it. There was nothing he could do. They were out there leaking, they were conspiring against him, and that got to him. It was extremely unpleasant for him.
This was his own cabinet colleagues?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I'm no longer prepared to tolerate the present situation. In short, it is time to put up or shut up.
In the number 10 garden, Major had suddenly challenged his cabinet opponents to stand against him for the Tory leadership. The arch-Eurosceptic John Redwood, surrounded by a colourful band of supporters, took up Major's challenge. He resigned from the cabinet and stood for the leadership on an uncompromising Eurosceptic ticket.
Conservatives should be doing. And all the time I was Prime Minister, I would not bring proposals forward to abolish the pound.
It was a dramatic moment. Here is the Prime Minister who resigns and tells people to put up or shut up. But when he was asked, he thought that no member of his cabinet would stand against him.
Well, and he misjudged it, didn't he?
Hi, What's happened to the drinks? It'll be midnight before they get here.
Where's that?
Although John Major did manage to fend off Redwood's challenge, there was to be no lasting victory. Despite valiant battles in his own cabinet, the divisions over Europe helped bring about Major's downfall. When Tony Blair came to power, he inherited the inflammatory issue of whether to abolish the pound and join the euro. Beneath the smiles at the very first meeting of the cabinet, both Blair and Gordon Brown knew that the government would at some stage have to take the euro decision. But so far, the cabinet has had no detailed discussions about whether or not to join. Instead, ministers have agreed to wait and see whether Gordon Brown's criteria for membership are met.
At the end of the day, you are making a decision about the criteria as to whether you should or you shouldn't. And if you had a big argument about are we going in tomorrow or not tomorrow, you might have more controversy.
Now, you and I know there were a lot of differences around that table, some of them quite strongly held. But individuals made the conclusion that this is where we think it best to stand while we get on trying to deliver some of the other things.
Coffee time in the anteroom for Blair's latest cabinet. Don't mention the euro has remained the watchword. But the cabinet will have to discuss the euro question before long. And once again, the decision will be crucially dependent on the outcome of the often stormy battles between the Prime Minister and his restlessly ambitious Chancellor. Their relationship is at the heart of the Blair system of cabinet government. But the body language between Blair and Brown when they met in the cabinet room in July scarcely suggested that the two were in closest harmony.
I'm here on Tuesday.
Tony's always said you can't have a division between your Chancellor and the Prime Minister, and he's absolutely right at that. And of course, one of the problems in politics is you may have two people, but they all have their people around them, and sometimes you get quotes given from the side of the mouth and nobody actually quoted, which has led to certain tensions from time to time. I've been involved in some of those scrapes myself, so I understand them.
When you have two people that aren't working together, and that's the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, it doesn't lead to positive, easy decision-making. You know there's a battle going on, and people support or people go to one side or the other, and I think that is just crippling for a government.
And is that what was happening with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair?
Well, they were not happy.
The Blair-Brown nexus is central to the way this cabinet is run. And in past governments, the relationship between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister has had a troubled history.
It always goes wrong.
It always goes wrong? Why does it always go wrong?
Well, because the economy in the end always goes wrong. And the Prime Minister is at one remove from the management of the economy, and the Chancellor is presiding over an economy that he doesn't actually control. And so it goes wrong. I mean, it's the natural sort of way of politics.
But if they kind of fall out publicly, then the government, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet's in trouble if they don't present a united front.
But even if they don't fall out publicly, their supporters will fall out for them publicly.
But the greatest potential destabiliser of the cabinet system can come at times of military conflict. An object lesson is the fate nearly 50 years ago of the debonair Tory Prime Minister Sir Anthony Eden. Eden became obsessed by the Egyptian President Colonel Nasser. Nasser was an Arab nationalist who wanted to export violent revolution across the Middle East and destroy Western imperialism. When he seized back the Suez Canal from British and French control, Eden determined to take military action against Nasser.
We all know this is how fascist governments behave. And we all remember, only too well, what the cost can be in giving in to fascism.
Sir Anthony Eden demonised Colonel Nasser. He felt Nasser had betrayed him. Eden was driven by a personal loathing of Colonel Nasser in 1956, which overrode everything else. And it's very hard to curb a Prime Minister who's got religion on something. Very, very hard indeed.
Without telling his cabinet, Anthony Eden forged a military plot with the French and the Israelis. In strictest secrecy, top men from the three governments drove to a house outside Paris to fix a complex deal to seize back the canal by military force. British troops landed at Suez. Eden's cabinet was still largely in the dark. In London, there were bitter protests. And under pressure from the Americans, Eden was forced humiliatingly to withdraw from Suez.
Eden broke all the rules of a prime minister in warlike circumstances. He didn't bring his full cabinet into proper confidence, so they knew more than they ever let on about the secret agreements with the French and the Israelis and so on. He didn't listen to his professional military advisors because they warned him and told him things he didn't want to hear. He allowed it to not just get personal, but remain personal.
I think the Anthony Eden experience shows you two things. One is losing a war is disastrous for a political career. It was curtains for him. And secondly, I think a massive deception practiced against all your political colleagues is impossible to sustain.
And now, can I just say, thank you very much for all your kindness to me, all of you, during my period of office. I wish my successor all good fortune, and Godspeed to you all. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Eden resigned, a cautionary tale of a prime minister who tried to run a war behind the back of his own cabinet. 25 years later, the Argentines invaded the Falklands. The surrender of the token force of British Marines symbolised national humiliation for the Prime Minister.
I can only tell you that from the day that I heard that they might invade, to the night when we heard that the white flags were flying over Port Stanley, I lived at an intensity, at a concentration that I have never experienced before or since.
Not known for her collective approach, Mrs. Thatcher now felt the need of her cabinet around her. At night, she held a second emergency cabinet meeting in 12 hours.
It was a very sombre cabinet. I think everybody appreciated that if we had added a military disaster to a diplomatic failure, you know, that would be the end of the Thatcher government. That wasn't spoken, but it was in everybody's mind. And it was a very risky enterprise. I mean, 8,500 miles away from home, 4,500 miles away from the nearest land base, Ascension. It was a huge undertaking.
The biggest naval task force since the Second World War was hastily assembled over a weekend, and it set off for the Falklands. But Mrs. Thatcher, who had no military experience, faced the problem of how to run a war if diplomatic efforts to reach a peaceful solution failed. She turned for advice to one of her predecessors. Harold Macmillan had served under Eden during Suez and in Winston Churchill's War Cabinet.
He said that it was a great mistake to have the Chancellor of the Exchequer in a war cabinet, because then people started to fuss about the cost of it all, and that took your eye off the ball, the goal of winning. When you're putting soldiers, sailors, airmen's lives at risk, you can't be fussing about the precise details of how much each bullet costs or whether you can afford a replacement tank or something. You've taken the decision to put your servicemen's lives on the line, and you have to do whatever's necessary to make sure they're properly supported.
The members of her war cabinet were the Deputy Prime Minister, Willie Whitelaw, who was later to admit he had visions of Suez during the Falklands. Francis Pym, the Foreign Secretary, was seen by Mrs. Thatcher as insufficiently resolute. But the party chairman, Cecil Parkinson, was a Thatcher loyalist. And key members were the Defence Secretary John Nott and the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Terry Lewin.
She was a relatively new Prime Minister still, with relatively little experience of military affairs, and therefore needed the expert advice that came from the Chief of the Defence Staff and from the Ministry of Defence for the decisions which needed to be taken.
As our troops abandoned stricken ships and made landfall in the Falklands, their progress was agonisingly monitored by the War Cabinet in London.
She ran a twin-track cabinet system then. She would have an extra cabinet meeting, usually on the Tuesday morning, to brief them, with her special War Cabinet, a subgroup of her Defence and Overseas Policy Committee, proper cabinet committee, doing most of the executive operational stuff. She took the classic model of how to do it, and she did it very well. And she put on one side, for the duration of that conflict, her command and control impulses, and played the collective leader. Very sensible, very important.
I have just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
The victory parade in the city. The Falklands had transformed Mrs. Thatcher's political standing. She'd started the war as the most unpopular Prime Minister in British political history.
If you look at Mrs. Thatcher after the Falklands compared to Mrs. Thatcher before, it's a different personality. It's a much more confident personality, much more aware of the powers of leadership, and that very strong brand dominance, if you like, of Thatcherism, the identification of the government with the Prime Minister. It is a feature. I think a war cabinet plays a role in creating that sort of situation.
Although Mrs. Thatcher had won in the Falklands using the textbook model for a war cabinet, she saw no subsequent need to behave in a collegiate manner, and she became increasingly to dominate her ministers. Matters came to a head with her long-time rival Michael Heseltine, who'd become Defence Secretary. He believed that Mrs. Thatcher was illegitimately seeking to deny his right to oppose her, and there was a showdown in a cabinet meeting.
The issue is the way she behaved, and she tried to rig the situation. I said that I cannot accept that conclusion, folded my papers, walked away. And of course it was portrayed as storming out. I've never stormed out of anywhere. I'm a pancake, you know. I'm a very, very calm, controlled person, but nobody cheats on me.
It would be wrong for me to say anything at this instant. I have resigned from the Cabinet and I will make a full statement later today.
Heseltine was the first minister in 100 years to resign during a cabinet meeting. But over the next 4 years, Mrs. Thatcher would lose a number of her other cabinet ministers after increasingly bitter rows.
It's not a very happy cabinet, that last one, at all. One could see it disintegrating in a way that as the number grew who did not share her view, and the number who did melted away. I once sort of sat idly looking around the room, and I thought, you know, she'd be very pressed to win an election if the cabinet were the voters.
In the leadership contest provoked by Michael Heseltine, Mrs. Thatcher sought the support of her own cabinet ministers. One by one in her room in the Commons, her ministers told her they thought she was finished. At 9 the next morning, ministers arrived for a special cabinet meeting.
Are you still behind the Prime Minister, Mr. Waterbury?
They were to hear from the Prime Minister that she'd decided to resign.
There was a rather dramatic moment when one of the cabinet said, you know, Michael is guilty of regicide. And she said, in that amazingly frank way, oh, no, 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 she said, it wasn't Michael. She said, it was the cabinet. Which was quite a moment.
And after it was over, there was a look on their faces, some of them. What have we done? But it had been done. There was no turning back.
Margaret Thatcher would later say that she'd been brought down by treachery with a smile on its face. She'd won a war and had won 3 general elections, but she'd come to take her cabinet for granted, and in the end, when she needed them most, they turned against her. Tony Blair knows what it's like to be a victorious war leader, but as the people of Kosovo chanted his name, Blair could scarcely have imagined that 2 years after the Balkans, he would once again be facing war.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
What happened, actually, as far as the cabinet and the cabinet system is concerned, once the horrible events of the 11th happened?
Well, the horrific memory of it, I stood with Tony Blair and saw it happen. Of course, we were both at the TUC, and the consequences of it were really horrific. And that inevitably meant that government would obviously be meeting, and Tony did call a meeting of the cabinet members.
Blair played it by the book. First, he went to the Cabinet Office to meet his key ministers and top security officials. In the secret briefing room, they put the country on a state of the highest alert in case of terrorist attacks. Blair then called an emergency meeting of the full cabinet. They gave total backing to the American war on terrorism. Since September the 11th, the cabinet has met as normal once a week.
Full cabinet in this emergency is reported to in the way it was on the Balkans. And it gets more time to talk about these sorts of things than it does on some others, like economic affairs, for example. But still, it is a reporting to body rather than a serious player in this. And the collegial nature of it is very much confined in real terms to the War Cabinet rather than the full cabinet.
The Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Michael Boyce, is a leading member of the War Cabinet that Blair set up when the military action against Afghanistan began. Sir Stephen Lander, the head of MI5, the security service, is also a member. Unusually, the Chancellor is in the War Cabinet and is involved in cutting off bin Laden's finances. Another member is the Overseas Development Secretary Claire Short, who had initially expressed her public reservations about the prospect of American bombing. The War Cabinet discusses the latest military and diplomatic developments.
Condemns the Taliban and then calls for the broad-based multi-ethnic group and asks for support for the approach. It was originally going to be the guidelines laid down by Brahimi, but it's now the approach, and that change was actually important.
Blair's formal War Cabinet, which is larger than the traditional model, includes 8 ministers and the heads of the intelligence agencies. It has met once a week since the military action began.
On Brahimi, my assessment of Brahimi is that, and he has...
Along with Alistair Campbell in the War Cabinet, the key link man with the White House is Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's Chief of Staff. In a 24-hour-a-day war operation, defence and intelligence officials monitor the progress of the war. And at first light, Tony Blair goes through their reports.
If anybody thinks anybody can run this war on its own, I'm afraid they're sorely wrong, because it involves an awful lot of people in discussion, whether in the official structure or the unofficial structure, about how he prosecutes Britain's best interests in those circumstances.
The formal War Cabinet has a limited role. Blair has regular meetings and phone with a key inner group of ministers and officials from the War Cabinet. And one senior minister says the idea of big formal meetings during a fast-moving war is outdated. Since September the 11th, Blair has embarked on a dizzying round of personal diplomacy. His aim has been to strengthen and hold together the worldwide coalition against terrorism. The public aspect of this high-profile diplomatic jet-setting has led to accusations that Blair has taken his presidential style of government to new heights in running the war.
Now, you in the armed forces are our front line in that struggle for freedom, for justice.
On Blair's trips, his constant companions have been his closest number 10 advisors, Alistair Campbell and Angie Hunter. The fact that they, rather than the Foreign Secretary, have accompanied Blair on his diplomatic whistle stops has given ammunition to those who claim that the Prime Minister has been sidelining his cabinet in war as he does in peace.
He makes decisions with a small coterie of people, advisors, just like a President of the United States. He doesn't go back to cabinet. He isn't inclusive in terms of the other cabinet ministers. And if he really wants to hold people in to support and get the support of the public and the support of the Parliament, there has to be more people included.
Of course Tony Blair's got advisors all around him, politically, military, all sorts of people, which influence his view from day to day. After all, prime ministers from different countries, presidents from countries, ring him during the day and the night, and he has to be kept up to speed with all sorts of things. Of course they play a role, but the cabinet still plays an essential role, as in any government, in cabinet government, in carrying out the policy of the government, with the prime minister listening to those views and making decisions. He does it through the full cabinet, he'll do it within the war cabinet, he'll do it within subcommittees on the cabinet dealing with domestic and political problems.
Well, yes, I think there is a war cabinet, which isn't cabinet government. I mean, they're treating cabinet as if it's irrelevant, as if it doesn't work, and it probably isn't working, because I think Tony's acting more like a president than a prime minister. And in that situation, the cabinet itself is dead. It doesn't have a function to play.
And what do you say to someone like Mo Mowlam, who says that cabinet government is now dead?
Well, she's daft.
This week in Downing Street, the fall of Kabul was seen as a vindication of Blair's strategy and running a war. Like Mrs. Thatcher in the Falklands, he's used the official military, diplomatic and intelligence machinery as a key insurance for a Prime Minister. But since he came to power, Tony Blair has downgraded the traditional system of cabinet government that he sees as old-fashioned and ineffective. But the fate of Mrs. Thatcher is an object lesson not to take the cabinet for granted.
Just look round that cabinet table. Do you think they're going to sit there like sheep and not say what they think? Of course they say what they think, but at the end of the day, there's a major unity and consensus around the policy that's being put forward by the Prime Minister, and there's never been any doubt about that.
If and when British politics does return to normal, Blair's ministers will need to show whether he has so remoulded cabinet government that it is now dead, or whether it's been merely sleeping.